I'm an organizational psychologist by training. That's a nerdy way of saying I study work. In particular, I study teams because, well, the reality is that work is teamwork. I don't suppose any of you thinks you do your work entirely by yourself. No, you know, whether you're a leader or an individual contributor, you know that your work is supported by the people on your team who have your back. And maybe not all of the time, because let's be real, I study teams. And some teams tend to be more enjoyable to work on than others, right? We've all had that experience of being on a team where ideas are just flying, the support is there, you can feel it, it's tangible, where you're excited to go to things like meetings, right? And where you end every day with more energy than you start. We've all been on a team like that in our career, and we've all been on teams that are kind of the opposite of that. We've all been on teams where we feel like everybody's fighting all of the time. We've all been on teams where we dread jumping into that meeting room or onto that video call. We've all been on teams where we feel like every single person on the team believes they're the one carrying the weight. I'm sorry, let me put that. We've all been on teams where we're carrying the weight, right? And look, I was a business school professor for 10 years, so I realize that I've just described every school team you've ever been put on at any level of your education. I get it. I had a student once actually after a senior thesis project come to me and tell me that thanks to my class, she had thought deeply about what was going to go in her will. And I was like, that's a little weird because it's an organizational behavior class, but okay, I'll bite. Said, yeah, well, I named the people on my senior thesis team in my will. I want them to be my pallbearers. And I thought, that's a little morbid. Why? And she said, well, I think it'd be great if they could let me down one more time. I walked right into it. So I study teams and I study what's the difference between these teams and these teams, the exhilarating teams and the exhausting teams. And at the core of it, one of the things I find interesting is that when we ask about the differences between those teams, so often we don't really understand exactly what's going on beneath the surface. Let me give you an example. A colleague of mine, Amy Edmondson at Harvard University, once did a study of a myriad of hospitals in the Boston area. In particular, she studied the teams of nurses that existed on the different wards. So every hospital has labor and delivery, intensive care, et cetera. Those are staffed by nurses, and those teams are led by a charge nurse, the nurse in charge of the whole team. And what Amy and her research team did was they gave those nurses a variety of different surveys and metrics, and they asked essentially, evaluate the effectiveness of your team leader. And then they took those evaluations and they looked at all of the different performance metrics of the teams. And they found some really interesting stuff you would expect, like that the great leaders had higher performance ratings, had higher patient satisfaction ratings, had faster turnaround times, were more able to deal with unexpected incidents, et cetera. But they found one thing really, really interesting, counterintuitive, in fact. And even Amy worried that, like, wait a minute, I don't understand what's going on here. They found that the teams that had the highest rated leaders also had the highest rates of reported accidents on the ward. Now that's a little weird, right? Okay, so great leaders and great teams make more mistakes. What's going on here? It wasn't until they started doing qualitative research, going in and talking with each individual team, watching how they interacted, that they realized that when I say the great teams had a higher rate of reported accidents, that word reported is carrying an awful lot of weight. See, it turns out what was happening was that the great teams felt like they could actually admit the mistakes that they made, prescribing errors, administration errors, et cetera. And the poor teams felt like they had to hide those things, right? So the poor teams, in addition to being massively unethical, the poor teams were keeping mistakes from each other, not informing the rest of the team on what was going on. And really, if you think about it, not letting that team continue to learn from those mistakes. We'll come back to that thought in a moment. And when I ask most people, okay, when you look beneath the surface and you describe this idea, what's going on, most people give me the same answer. Most people say, oh, well, those teams had a bigger amount of trust on the team. Those teams had higher levels of trust. And that's true, but it doesn't totally define what's going on underneath the surface and the culture of that team. What Amy would say is that those teams, in addition to having trust, had a higher than average rate of what she would call psychological safety, on the team. This is a climate on a team that's marked by a sense of feeling safe to express yourself and to take risks. And an important caveat here, when I say risks, I don't mean like risky ethical behavior, I don't mean like going the wrong way by patients, etc. What I mean is interpersonal risks. And there's a lot of things that fall into that category of interpersonal risk. Admitting a mistake is a huge interpersonal risk. If you don't have a level of trust on the team to where you feel like you're going to have that held against you, you feel like you're going to be ridiculed for that, you're going to get a negative performance rating for that, etc., you're going to be less willing to take the risk of admitting a mistake. But when you look at several teams, you also find that things like speaking up because you disagree with the consensus, that's a huge interpersonal risk, right? You might be seen as someone who's rocking the boat. Even just expressing an out-of-the-box idea, hey, I know we've never tried this, but what if we did? That's an interpersonal risk. You're risking judgment by that. And so these teams of great leaders were more willing to take those risks. And it points to what I look at as sort of the cycle of psychological safety. Yes, trust matters. You build trust on a team so that people feel safe to take that risk. And then once they take that risk, we're not out of the woods yet, because we have to look at how the team is going to respond to that risk. You share a crazy idea, are you going to be ridiculed? You disagree, are you going to be shot down and labeled as the negative person on the team? You admit a failure, are you going to have that held against you? What we need, and what Amy Edmondson saw, was that we need teams who will respond to people taking interpersonal risks with a sense of respect. Now, you've all been in this scenario, whether you realize it or not. You've probably been in a situation where you shared your brilliant idea. You think it's totally awesome, and then somebody says, we can't do that. We don't have the budget for that. We tried something like that a couple years ago. It didn't work. Right? Or you speak up to disagree, and all of a sudden the whole team just responds to you, shoots you down, and says, why do you have to be so negative and judgmental all the time? When you're in that situation where you, let's say, admit a failure, take that interpersonal risk of saying, here's how I messed up and what I learned, and people hold that over you, how much do you feel like you trust the team? You don't. And that's why it's more than just trust. It's this cycle of psychological safety. You build trust on a team so that people take the interpersonal risks that are then met with respectful behavior. You're heard, you're listened to, you're considered, you're valued. And what happens is trust grows. It's a virtuous cycle if done right, and a vicious cycle if done wrong. And when we look at the research on the highest performing teams, we consistently find that psychological safety is present in just about every team, in every industry, in every sector, in every generation, in every demographic. Why? Because psychological safety is what gets a team to learn from each other and support each other. Psychological safety is what convinces people on a team to take the risk of asking for help. And it's also what encourages people to take the risk of saying, I messed up here. I fixed it, I messed up here, or I messed up here and I need your help, and then we can have a conversation about how we get better over time. When I think about this plays out, I think about one of my favorite case studies in psychological safety, and actually one of my favorite leaders of all time, a man named Alan Mulally. And Alan Mulally was the CEO of Ford Motor Company in about 2006 when they needed a turnaround. Bill Ford, the great-grandson of Henry Ford, realized he couldn't turn the company around. The company's stock was trading at $1 a share. What they told shareholders that year was that if they did everything according to plan, they were going to lose $17 billion. Yeah, right? I thought my checkbook looked nasty, right? $17 billion loss. And so this was the company that Alan inherited as CEO, but he also inherited a team that was very low on psychological safety, and that's the nicest way I can put it. This was a team where people were afraid to admit mistakes because they knew they were going to get stepped over. This is a team where people saw their competition for promotion to the next level as more important than their competition, meaning the other automotive companies. This is a team where if you showed a kink in your armor, someone would stab you in it. This is a team where if you shared an out-of-the-box idea, someone would ridicule you for it. Have you ever been on a team like this? You don't have to point fingers at anyone in this room. There's 1,000 people in this room. Please don't tell me who it was. But did you get your best work out of a team like that? Of course not. And what Alan identified very, very early is that that was what was holding back this team from figuring out what they needed to do. He needed to build a sense of psychological safety, not only on the senior leadership team, but down throughout the entire organization. But to start, he wanted to send a message to people that we need to be a company where we tell it like it is. We need to be a place where we admit our vulnerabilities and our failures, even if they seem damaging to our reputation. I'll give you an example of this. Very first day as the new leader of the company, every publicly traded company does the same thing. You hold a press conference, the new leader comes out, gives a speech, blah, 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 shareholder value, blah, 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 efficiencies, blah, blah, blah. I hope you believe that the stock is gonna go up. Like everybody does that show. And then there's often like a Q&A time. And Alan was not from the automotive industry, and all of the reporters who were there, all of the media was there, knew that. And so they decided to throw him some curveball questions. My favorite one of the very first questions he got asked, "Hey, Mr. Mulally, what kind of car do you drive?" Some of you can see where this is going. Keep in mind, Alan is the new CEO of Ford Motor Company. So put a car in your head that would be your answer. A make and a model. Well, not a make, because, put a car in your head, what you think, okay? Here's what Alan said. "I drive a Lexus. It's the finest car on the market." What are you doing? What? That's not even an American-made car. Very quickly, he pivoted to this idea of, that's why I'm excited about the opportunity at Ford. I recognize we have some work to do. I believe that we can take them on head on and we can compete with them. Otherwise, I wouldn't have taken this job. So very quickly pivots it into that. But the message is sent. I am going to call it like it is, and I'm going to reward people who call it like it is. I need that sense of psychological safety where you're willing to tell me what's going on. The other thing he did to the senior leadership team is he asked them to engage in a regular series of meetings where they would come together and they would talk about how they were performing according to the turnaround plan. He called these the business plan review, probably because he couldn't think of a better name, that's all. And at each of these meetings, now there's about 12 senior leaders in the firm. This is the core team that if we don't turn this team around, the rest of it's gonna fall apart. And they went over hundreds of metrics, 312 different metrics, because this is a global firm. So that could get a little confusing. So what Alan asked people to do is, as you're giving your reports, do us all a favor and color code your slides for us so that we know, okay, is this good, is this bad, where are we? So color code your slides, green, yellow, or red. A green slide would mean everything's going according to plan, right? We're on pace, we're on plan, etc. A yellow slide would mean we have some problems, but we have a plan to get back onto plan. And a red slide would mean I need help. We have something wrong, and I don't know what it is or how to fix it, but I need you to be informed, and I need your help. That would be a red slide. Everybody got it? Okay, now, first meeting happened in October, 7 a.m., Thunderbird Conference Room, Dearborn, Michigan. Attendance was mandatory. Okay, actually, as Alan would put it, it's not mandatory to attend the meeting, but it's also not mandatory to be a member of the senior leadership team. Right? So attendance is mandatory, and everyone assembles their master deck of all of these reports and all of the metrics of success and all of the color-coded slides. There's 312 slides, and guess what color they are? No, they're all green. Every single slide is green. In a company that's gonna lose $17 billion. What is that? Well, we've all been on a team like that. That is, everyone knows what's wrong, but no one feels safe to share it. We've all been on a team like that. And by the way, this wasn't just like one meeting and Alan said, very funny, okay, now tell us how it really is. This went on for 8 weeks. Week 2, 312 green slides. Week 3, 312 green slides, on. And Alan just kept trying to say, hey, take this risk. We need to talk about it. We can't manage a secret. And it wasn't until week 8 when something changed. On week 8, one executive decided he had to take a risk. And truthfully, he was sort of forced to do it. Mark Fields. Mark was in charge of the launch of the Ford Edge. You all remember the Edge? The Edge was about to be rolled out, about to be launched. It was being produced in Oakville, Ontario, and there was a bottleneck. There was a quality problem that could be fixed, but had to be fixed manually, and that was delaying the shipping out of all of the cars. And Mark realized on a Wednesday afternoon, preparing for the Thursday morning meeting, that they were going to have to delay the launch because there was no way they were getting the cars there in time. And so Mark is talking with his team, and he says, we need to tell them. And I think this is one of those reds that Alan keeps bumbling on about. And his team, it's funny, his team goes, you can't do that. Mark, you can't do that. Mark, if you're the first red slide, we're all gone. You can't be the first red slide. I don't know, guys. I think we need to tell them. Have you ever been in a situation where somebody finally comes to you with a problem and you're like, oh, it would have been so much better if you came to me with this problem 8 weeks ago? Right? This is what's happening. So finally, though, in week 8, Mark Fields makes a decision. Mark decides to change one slide red. It's Mark's turn. They come to him. Yep, on the Edge launch, we're red. We're going to have to delay. Don't have an estimate of when it'll be. Yep, it was that quiet. I interviewed Alan to get all of the details, the real details of the story. He told me everybody just alternated between looking at Mark and looking at Alan. Looking at Mark, taking a good long look at Mark. Bye, Mark. And then looking back at Alan. Alan told me he felt like he was waiting for everyone was waiting for him to hit a button under the desk, right? And two big people in suits and earpieces were going to come out and just hook Mark up and just escort him out, right? Or a trap door would just fall open. But that's not what he did. Instead, he started clapping. Hey, Mark, that's great visibility. All right, team, what can we do for him? And they started talking about the issues that Mark was facing. They started to put a plan together. They didn't solve the problem overnight. I wish I could tell you that one meeting solved the whole problem, but it didn't. And in fact, it didn't really change how any of the other executives, other team members responded when they had to prep their slides for the next week. The next week, they showed up, and the deck looked the exact same. Mark's one problem, and no one else is willing to admit a problem. But I'll let you in on a little secret. Nobody thought Mark was going to be in that meeting. Alan actually asked Mark to come there early. So when the rest of the team filed into the room, Alan and Mark were sitting right there. Can you imagine the confusion, right? Mark's still here. He's not fired. Did he get promoted? What is happening right now? And Alan would tell me that moment, not the clapping, but the moment when everyone walked in and saw that Mark came to them with a problem. He was respected, heard, honored, and helped by the team, and not punished for something that was outside of his control. Alan told me that one moment was the moment that changed Ford. Because in week 10, guess what the slides looked like? It was a sea of color. We had greens, we had yellows, we had reds. We had an accurate picture of what was actually going on at the company. And little by little, they could make changes. And little by little, over a decade, they went from a company that was losing $17 billion to a company that in his final year as leader posted a $6.6 billion profit. Yeah. The share price went from $1 to $17 a share. I know what you're thinking. Man, if I could go back in time and buy Ford stock and Bitcoin in 2006. All right, maybe not the Bitcoin part. Alan showed the board a 17-fold increase in the stock price. And when he was ready to announce his resignation, he showed the board one other thing. He showed them a recommendation for who should succeed him as CEO. I'll give you one guess who he recommended. Mark Fields, first person to turn his slide red. That's a great story, isn't it? I would love to. Thank you, yeah. You have no idea what's coming. I would love to end the story there. Mark Fields made it 18 months before he was asked by the board to resign. And ever since then, there's been sort of a revolving door of people in the leadership of the company. I'm willing to bet the board wishes they had Alan back. Alan, not willing to do it. He's having a blast in retirement. Why? Why did that happen? Remember what I told you at the top. It's a cycle. You build trust on a team so that the team feels safe to take those risks, and then you meet those risks with respect, respectful behavior that honors the person and supports the person, and trust increases. If you don't do all three, the cycle reverses. And so while Alan was capable of forcing that cycle to go upward the whole time, not everybody was. This is not something you do once. We don't just say, hey, we need to build trust on a team. Let's all fall backwards and try and catch each other. Not recommended, right? Let's all do the boards and planks and crossing the invisible river. Let's take a personality test. Let's do whatever to build trust. And then we're good. We got trust. Let's move on to the next thing. This is not something that works like that. Those things are great, but they're the beginning. We need to be monitoring that cycle. Whether you're a leader or just a teammate, what's going on in your team? Are you in that cycle of trust, risk, and respect? And as we think about this, let me give you 3 ways, no matter what your role is, that you can keep that cycle going. Number 1, signal vulnerability. Why? Vulnerability to your team is the beginning of saying that you trust them. It's you taking that risk. By the way, leaders in the room, I'm speaking to you. I'm going to be speaking to you later this week too, but I'm speaking to you. Go first. Be willing to be vulnerable about your mistakes, your confusion. I'm not, and by the way, when I say vulnerability here, I don't mean you have to leave from here, go back to your team and say like, well, this guy, Dr. Burkus, said we need to be more vulnerable. So I want you to know, I feel like my parents never loved me. I don't mean that. I don't mean like vulnerability, like you have to tell your whole team, I never had a date for junior prom. I got dumped a week beforehand, which is a true story, but we're going to move on. You don't have to, but sometimes just saying, I don't know in this situation. Or sometimes just coming to them and saying, hey, earlier in my career, I did this and it was a huge mess up, and here's what I learned. We know from the research, both psychological and actually neurological research, that when people show a flash of vulnerability, it makes the person who's receiving it feel trusted, and they are more likely to respond with trustworthy behavior. So if you're a leader, you go first. And if you have a leader on your team who's not willing to go first, then guess what? You're the new leader in terms of vulnerability. You go first. However you're comfortable. You only have to be as vulnerable as you are comfortable in the moment to kickstart the cycle, and then the cycle will increase. Number 2, call for candor on your teams more often. What I mean by candor, remember the other interpersonal risk, speaking up because you disagree. Sometimes when I talk about trust and psychological safety, people confuse that with sort of this idea that you're never going to hear things you disagree with. That's not psychological safety. Psychological safety is that even though I disagree, I feel safe saying that to the team, and I feel like they're going to hear me and listen to me. Now, some of us do this. Some teams do this well, but other teams, I feel like we think that we ask for disagreeing opinions. We think we're calling for candor enough. Like we open the door a teeny bit, but not really. And here's what I mean. Like, have you ever gotten one of those emails, right, that says, it's big thesis statement, it's text on text on text, it's pages long, you sprained your finger scrolling through the whole thing, right? And then at the very bottom it says, thoughts, ? That's not what I mean when I say call for candor. My only thought is your email's way too long, but that's me personally. But that's not really a true invitation to like a robust discussion about what we agree and disagree on. That's not what I mean. Or other times will be, you ever had this happen to you? Where at the end of a meeting, there's a minute left before our next meeting, and somebody flashes out, whoever's running the meeting just goes, okay, well, before we wrap up, any questions, concerns, clarifications? You ever received that one? Questions, concerns, clarifications? I love that one, right? Because it rolls off the tongue, and everybody knows we don't actually mean it, because it's so simple to say. Questions, concerns, clarification. It's like when you're at a wedding and you're getting towards the end and the officiant does that thing where they say, okay, now if anyone has any reason why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your questions, concerns, clarifications. You know you're not supposed to say anything, right? Nobody says anything in that, unless you're on a soap opera and you've been dead for 2 seasons, nobody says anything. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, like, what if we took it on ourselves? What if we took it on ourselves to have more candor? What if instead of, hey, anyone have any questions, we said things like, hey, before we wrap up, it sounds like we're headed towards consensus. What am I missing? Do you get the difference? Or even just from any questions to what questions do we have? Right? See, one is like, if you don't understand, this is the 1 minute I'll give you to ask for clarification. The other is, I'm confident that I was not clear enough, that I messed up explaining something, and that you probably need a little clarification from me. What questions do you have for me? One puts it on them, the other puts it on me. That's what I mean when I say call for that sense of candor. And then the last one, celebrate failure. And I don't mean like you are grossly incompetent in your job, you have compromised the safety of multiple people, you have consistently underperformed in every review. Here's a trophy. I don't mean that. That's not what I mean when I say celebrate failure. What I mean is that when someone comes to you as a leader or as a team member, and they come to you because they made a mistake, celebrate the amount of trust that had to happen for that moment to happen. Celebrate the transparency in the fact that they were willing to tell you all of the details. Celebrate the fact that 6 months or a year from now, we're going to have learned from that mess up, and we're going to have been a stronger, more capable team. What I mean when I say celebrate failure is this. I for the last 20-something years, I've competed, trained, now coach competitors, and travel all over helping people in this really esoteric martial art called Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. I know, it's as weird as it sounds. It's like wrestling, but you do it in pajamas, right? And instead of pinning someone, you're trying to hyperextend their limb or choke them unconscious. Now, if you're a competitor in this sport, your first competition, you probably got a little nervous, right? And we tell everyone the exact same thing before they get out in their first competition. There are only 2 options in a competition. It's not win or lose. It's win or learn. You win, we'll raise your hand, we'll celebrate, we'll put a medal around you, we'll be super excited. You lose, we'll go back to the gym, we'll go, well, here's what you did, and here's how to avoid that, and you will get stronger as a result. And that's what I mean when I say celebrate failure, and that's what I mean when I say psychological safety as a whole. It's about teams embracing a win or learn mentality, being comfortable talking to each other about our wins, but also about our learning moments, so that we as a team figure out how to perform better, figure out how to perform stronger, and tap into what we might even call that growth mindset. That's what propels, more than anything else, propels those exhausting teams to the exhilarating ones. Teams that have adopted that win or learn mentality. They're the ones that consistently perform better. They're the ones that consistently grow in trust. And they're the ones that become what I like to call the best teams ever. And because of today, the teams that allow people to live their best lives ever. Thank you all so much for having me.
David Burkus.